Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished representative of PEMNA Steering Committee, PEMNA Secretariat, the World Bank, and other international institutions, and also PEMNA member countries. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, nice to see you again in this 2022 PEMNA PCOP webinar. As we realize, time goes so fast, and this year, 2021 has passed. And now, it is the second quarter of 2022. Before we start to discuss our essential topic today, let me first express my gratitude to the PEMNA PCOP member, as well as all various stakeholders that join this forum. I would also like to extend my appreciation to the PEMNA Secretariat and also PCOP facilitator for their full support and cooperation, as well as for organizing this PCOP webinar. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, we are currently in 2022. Which means it has been more than 2 years since the COVID pandemic first occurred in Indonesia, occurred in March 2020. Maybe in other countries already start in the end of 2019. That's why the name is COVID-19. Throughout 2020, we fought for help against the virus and its impact by implementing a strict health protocol and restriction activity. Meanwhile, at the same time, we also fought to recover the economic condition, as we realized our economy grew negatively in 2020, bringing back to the positive economic growth in 2021. We hope this year, 2022, the recovery will continue. And of course, such conditions require all of us to remain focused on taking strategic steps, including issue policy that are relevant and have broad impact in accordance with the plan objective. There must be lesson learned from the pandemic, and many reforms have been done. One of the important development is regarding ICT, Information and Communication Technology. ICT infrastructure is very much needed if we take lesson from the impact of COVID-19 pandemic, where activities should continue, involving many people, many organizations, involving communication between countries, but the physical meeting between people are limited. While on the other hand, we have to maintain our service to the community. Our service to the people must be carried on and should be improved. So the problem in ICT infrastructure in a number of areas is still an obstacle to realize equal access to the information to the public. For example, if we want to conduct distance learning, but there is no internet connection. That's why availability of internet to support online activity is very important. The provision of infrastructure, such as the construction of the BTS, base transceiver station, even though there is also BTS from Korea, multifunctional satellites construction of national data center, and internet access at public service location is part of the ICT infrastructure that might need still be improved. Considering this essential issue, we hope that to use this webinar as a forum to share experience and knowledge in discussing our topic, budgeting for ICT. This is also a forum for us to take lessons from existing experience, including responding to the challenge of managing ICT budget. We also hope to be able to learn from our experts, as well as from other country experience delivered by PCOP fellow members. Distinguished guests, at the end of my speech, I would like to extend my warmest welcome to all of you. We hope that this webinar will result in rewarding discussion for better improvement. And this will be enriching experience to all of participants. I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak today and to be part of this important forum. Thank you and stay healthy. Thank you, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Now we will start the first session of this 2022 PEMNA PCOP webinar. I will moderate this session. In this session, we are delightful to have presentation from two international experts. The first is Mr. Peter Poulin. He has worked as a senior technical consultant with the World Bank and IMF for 10 years, since retiring from the Canada Revenue Agency as Chief Information Officer and Assistant Commissioner of the Information Technology Branch in 2012. While for the second speaker, we have Mr. Pilky Hong, Professor of Seoul Digital University, Korea. He has been involved in many IT-related research activities, including as the advisor of PEMNA PCOP Advisory Service Program. To Mr. Peter Poulin and Mr. Hong, we really appreciate your taking time of your busy schedule to give presentation in this PEMNA PCOP webinar. Ladies and gentlemen, the first presentation from Mr. Poulin will discuss ICT budgeting from the viewpoint of ICT lifecycle management, touching upon question of role of line ministry and Ministry of Finance. ICT infrastructure and application maintenance costs, and also managing change within development and maintenance contract based on example of Canada. As we realize the technology in ICT moving very fast. Then the second presentation from Mr. Hong will summarize the recent PEMNA Advisory Service activity based on experience of ICT budget management in Korea and Indonesia. Before start, let me inform, we have time for this session about 70 minutes. So that means each presenter will have talk about 35 minutes, including Q&A session. So the presentation time is maximum 20 minutes for each presenter. The participant can ask questions after each presentation, or if we still have time, question can be raised in the end of this session. So I would like to invite Mr. Poulin to start the presentation. Please, Mr. Poulin, the time is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Rofi, for the introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here this morning. I guess it is morning for you, with all of you today. And I'll move into the presentation. Let's get it up on the screen sharing. I talk about IT lifecycle management when you're budgeting for IT, because I've seen often, not just in the developing projects I'm working in around the world, but also in our own tax agency in Canada, often people think about the capital cost of the initial investment for a new business IT solution, but they don't understand that there's ongoing operational costs to sustain that solution as well. And they have to be budgeted for and planned for, or you're going to build something that you can't sustain for the long term, or will have improper weak maintenance that it won't deliver the business value that was fully expected. When you're, in government, aside from buying new buildings, and if you leave out the military, of course, tanks and airplanes and things like that, ICT projects are the largest capital expenditures that departments make. And all of these effectively touch the Ministry of Finance at some point for a funding decision, a funding approval, or identification of where funds will come from. And the reason that it's of interest is because you need proper capital expenditure management. It's a multi-year planning to do a major IT investment. You also have to think about procurement in a multi-year perspective, because it's not a one-time thing. These projects generally take more than 1 year. And then with infrastructure in place, this infrastructure all has a life cycle. There need to be supply arrangements in place for multiple years to sustain the infrastructure, add additional capacity, and evergreen the environment so that it continues to work. And that speaks to the asset sustainability. Also, when making these large investments, people want budget transparency. They want to understand, why are we investing millions of dollars in this new business solution, in this new IT infrastructure, and that needs to be visible and brought forward. And that's generally done through a business case for the investment. And we'll talk a bit about that later in the presentation. But IT investments need to be grounded in a business case that ties back to what the business of the department making the investment is about. There are no IT projects. They're all business projects to solve a business need, solve a business problem, in some way bring value to citizens and taxpayers through improved service delivery, improved performance in government. And lastly, again, the issue that's often overlooked is making sure that there's operational funding to sustain the IT infrastructure and the maintenance of the IT applications, and also to continue to evolve the application, because no IT project gets it right the first time when it's implemented over its 12 to 24 month development window. There's always things that were missed, things that weren't quite gotten correctly in the specification, or new good ideas that have to be worked into the solution after it's been implemented into production. I give an example in the presentation of the, the typical planning framework, planning cycle. I use a revenue authority. I have obviously 35 years experience working in a revenue authority, but you could substitute any other government ministry, whatever its mandate is, where you have to have, IT investments have to be linked back into the business strategies of the organization. So if you're going to invest in a large new tax collection solution for multi-millions of dollars, somewhere you should be able to find a business strategy from collections that explains the value of this and how it's going to improve tax revenues for the organization, etc. Again, the example I give you is tax, but you could change the headings to whatever kind of department you're in. And then within that, there's a roadmap for IT. It needs to have a longer term IT investment plan, at least a 3-year view, always looking ahead 3 years. What are we going to need to refresh in the way of infrastructure that is now past end of life? What new functionality are businesses demanding that are going to create new application development projects? And a separate topic, which we're not getting into today, is there should, within your IT organizations, be an IT capacity development plan. How is the government or this department going to get better at delivering IT solutions, meaning faster, less expensive, better quality? That too is something that a large IT organization should have in place. And then that flows into your annual business plan and your operations of the organization. So when you're looking to invest in IT, people get funding in one very large glump at the beginning of a project to say, we're going to do this wonderful new IT project. It needs $30 million of investment. We found the money in the budget, or we have a donor who's willing to lend us the money. So let's go forward and do this. And that's to cover the initial one-time investment cost, which is your hardware cost. But don't forget that hardware, if you buy it this year in 2027, you're going to have to replace it. Generally, most hardware has a 5-year life cycle, at which point it's at end of life as recommended by the manufacturer, and it needs to be replaced. So your submission to Ministry of Finance will cover the cost of this hardware, but it never covers the cost of ongoing evergreening of the hardware to replace it in 5 years and then again in 10 years. So this is something, Ministries of Finance need to make sure departments are aware of this issue and that they have plans on how they're going to address this issue. Software is more straightforward. It's the initial cost of the software is the capital investment on a large submission for IT development, as is the application development costs, whether it's a consultancy to come in and build or products that are going to be configured and customized to meet your business needs. Then on the ongoing operating cost side, which is not part of the submission for capital investments for a new ICT solution, you have the annual maintenance cost for hardware, which is usually about 20% of the actual capital cost of the hardware to keep the vendor available for patches and upgrades and to have remote support or in-person support in times of crisis. Similarly, software has costs that run to roughly 20% of the purchase price. Vendors actually make their money on the maintenance costs, not on the capital investment costs. When they sell you hardware or software, it's almost like it's a loss leader. Their profit comes more from maintenance costs, the ongoing recurring annual cost you're going to pay forever, as long as you keep using that infrastructure or solution. And then applications themselves, once they're implemented into production and come out of the, that window of development time that was covered by the initial capital budget for the project, they too have operating costs and costs to resolve incidents and problems and to do annual conversion of the application if it's tied to a legislative life cycle such as taxation. And then there are always requests for legislative change, functionality improvement, etc. These costs too have to be borne by the department that owns the solution. So again, that can range from 5% up to 25%, depending on the amount of agility, the pace of change that the owners want in that application. So again, if you keep adding new IT solutions and infrastructure to a department and don't address the ongoing recurring annual budget of that department to cover all of these costs, eventually things begin to rust out. You don't have staff or contracts in place for maintenance, and applications either cease to work or are no longer achieving what they were intended for when the business case was approved to actually make this significant IT investment. So I just encourage, from a Ministry of Finance perspective, you can't just ask, how much is this IT solution going to cost? We'll find the money and we'll do it. You have to ask, and then how are we going to sustain this new solution or this new infrastructure? Where is the money supposed to come from for that? Because the department that is receiving the benefit of the capital investment doesn't have the operating budget to sustain that capital investment unless the Ministry of Finance increases its operating budget, or in the case of Canada Revenue, instead of what we were basically told to do is find the money within your own operating budget through the efficiencies you've gained from this new IT solution or elsewhere, meaning less collectors, less auditors, whatever you had to do to pull budget resources to cover the ongoing operating costs, maintenance cost for the hardware, software, and the actual application itself. My experience has been in most countries I go into that these costs have not been addressed. And it's sad to go in and see something that was implemented 10 years ago and find that these servers and the software are all past their end of life. It's impossible now to upgrade the application because they've allowed too many versions to pass, too many upgrades to pass without following the vendor's upgrade path. And they effectively have to replace the entire solution. The entire capital investment is now lost, and you're basically starting over again with a new solution. It's a recurring theme I've seen in many countries, and it's because these ongoing operating costs aren't being addressed when projects are funded and departments are being left on their own, and their only response is do nothing. They have no money, they have no budget, they can't sustain the IT investment that was made. The next, this slide speaks is probably in too much detail for our discussion here, but it's just to reemphasize the point. IT investment planning is a multi-year program. You know, generally a central IT organization in government or an IT organization in a large department has a central budget and procurement plan for all of its IT assets. And that plan has to be updated every year. And it's updated based on the recurring hardware and software costs, your sustainability investments, and any kind of infrastructure improvements you want to make. But all that plan then has to go over to procurement and supply, because you need an equally 3-year view or more of your supply cycle to say, well, do we have contracts in place to be able to replace those servers in 2 years? Do we have contract in place to upgrade the software we need to upgrade? Do we have supply in place for application support consultants to come in and do some of this this maintenance that's needed? So you have the operation ongoing running, and that then you're looking at what do we need to do to sustain all this IT infrastructure and these applications, and then we work with procurement to say, do we have, because in my case it took 18 months minimum to do a large tender for infrastructure, hardware, software. I mean, it's not a fast process. So that's why you need the 3-year plan, the 3-year cycle on procurement tied back to your sustainability plans and your development plans to make sure supply is always in place. So I leave it there as just an example of good practices on how to, the questions to ask when you're talking to the CIO of a large IT organization in government. Have you thought of this? Have you addressed this? Have you looked after the procurement supply issues that are going to be hounding us for years to come to sustain this infrastructure? I find bizarre practices in some countries. When I'm coaching people on how to do a major IT investment for a new tax solution, say, which is a $10 to an $80 million application investment with infrastructure. The advice is always go for 2 years of maintenance if you can in the contract with the vendors, and try and have options for at least 5 additional years of maintenance, because the firm that built it is the firm that knows it and can give you the best maintenance. And in some countries, it's just not allowed. That's against the law. There's a practice of changing suppliers every 2 years because it keeps corruption down, is the theory. I don't think that works, but I have seen it practiced in several countries. And again, I encourage, think about ways to make a long-term partnership when tendering for a complex application. And in doing so, it's included in the budgeting that is done, supported by the Ministry of Finance. The ministry isn't just approving the large capital investment, it's also approving and recognizing, and for 5 years we'll have these maintenance costs, and people will know at the time the decision is made to fund the project, where are the ongoing maintenance costs coming from. From an investment planning perspective, I won't go through this chart, but it's just to give you an example. It's from one country I worked in a couple of years ago. We worked for, I think, 1.5 years looking at all of their infrastructure and all of their applications and talking with all of the business lines on what do you need in the way of new functionality, what do you need in the way of investment. And you come and, this boils down to a chart like this that lists the sustainability needs for infrastructure, for applications, and it lists the new functionality needs in the way of what new applications do we need or enhancements to applications we need. It puts a price on them all, and it ranks them all as to whether they're high, medium, or low priority. In reality, on this chart, there's only high priority. Medium and lows get scraped off before this is finalized and presented to the Ministry of Finance. And it asks hard questions about, well, if I gave you the money, where are you getting the resources to do this work? Because approving a project to a department that does not have the capacity to execute isn't very effective at delivering the business value that you're expecting from this major investment. So I leave it with you. Behind it, was more of a rigorous process on how do we assess sustainability gaps, and then how do we talk with each business line to say, what do you need and what's the value? If we give you what you need, what do you give back? And again, in my organization, Canada Revenue, our chief financial officer was very good at booking projected savings from business lines on whenever a new IT investment was made, to say, yes, we'll give you $30 million over 2 years to build that new workflow solution for this or that function. But in your business case, you said it would save you 40 person years. Therefore, at the end of 2 years, when the solution is implemented, we're reducing your operating budget by 40 person years of salary and transferring that to the investment fund to help to pay back this capital investment we've made. That was our operating principle in Canada Revenue, which worked as an independent revenue authority. It wasn't governed as strictly by the Treasury or the Ministry of Finance. It had its own capital investment fund. For roles, when you're talking to a CIO from a large department, I mean, they should know the currency of their inventory of IT assets in the way of hardware and software, that they're current and sustainable. As similarly for applications, what applications are at risk of failing because the products they were built with are no longer supported, or are they sustainable to the future? And a good CIO knows the business of the department it's working for, to understand what motivates each business line, what are its needs and drivers, and they work with them to develop business cases for capital investment in IT. It's not IT coming forward with a business case for investment. In our example, it was always the business line coming forward for the IT investment. So audit or collections or taxpayer service, they were the ones speaking to the CFO or to the Ministry of Finance saying, we need this many million for this investment. The CIO went with them, but it was the business line that owned the submission in the process. And lastly, again, the CIO role is to ensure all costs are identified, not just development costs, but they have a plan on how we're going to address the ongoing costs. Chief financial officers, they control the annual budget process in a department, obviously, but they also play a significant role, in our case they did, on quality control over ICT business case development, to ensure that the business case was legitimate, that it was evidence-based, there were facts there, and promises made that could be called upon, collected upon at the end of the project to help repay the cost of investment over time. They also played a role in the oversight of major IT investment projects. There was a steering committee that all major projects went to on a quarterly basis, chaired by the chief financial officer, not by the CIO, to ask the questions of, are we on time? Are we on budget? What are the issues that are threatening the success of this project? And again, they were very interested to make sure that we understood where the costs were coming from for at the end of this project to cover operations, and because they'd had the experience in the past where they were not addressed. And then years later, there's a crisis and the CFO has to reach into the coffers of the department to cover an unplanned cost. And lastly is to book the savings from the project, to ensure that the business case wasn't just used to sell the project, but people lived up to what the business case said. And if there were projected savings, they paid them, they gave up the savings. Treasury, or the Chancellery as it's called in some countries, basically are limited to setting ICT policy and giving oversight to departments complying with that policy. They played a challenge role in business case approval and development. And they champion in many countries the shared service initiatives that you're seeing, where countries are going to a shared infrastructure service across all departments from one IT organization. And lastly, they have a role to play on performance evaluation on IT project execution. And lastly, Ministry of Finance, largely, obviously you're in full control of the budget process. You're the approval authority for advancing funds for a business case that justifies the capital investment. And you're also the conduit for additional funds to come in outside of budget funds, should the government wish to work with a donor to support some investment in ICT infrastructure or new applications or both. And this is the last slide I'll speak to as the presentation, and it's a summary of what a proper business case for ICT investment should include. Obviously, it should have an executive summary that a non-IT person can understand, even a non-business person in that line of the department can understand. It explains what the value of this investment is regarding improved service, increased revenues, whatever the case may be. It should explain what happens if we don't invest. What's the cost of not investing? It should explain that we've looked at various options on how to solve this business problem, how to get the benefit, and give the cost savings decision-making criteria that led us to choose this alternative, this option. In our case, we also had an accuracy of assessment requirement on any business case submission, project submission. Are your estimates plus or minus 50%, plus or minus 20%, plus or minus 5%? When you get just about to project execution, they have to be plus or minus 5%. Explanation on how this ICT investment aligns to the corporate business plan or other government strategies or departmental strategies. A business case should come with an initial project plan that gives the scope statement for the project, planning assumptions and whatnot, and explains what deliverables will come at what phase in the project and the duration of those phases, and any cost savings that are being projected should be included in the project plan. There should be an explanation of the roles, responsibilities, and dependencies for the project. These are key risk factors for a project. If it's dependent on other organizations, external factors, they need to be highlighted here. The business case should include an evaluation framework so that we can tell if we're making progress. What key deliverables at each phase say that we're making progress, we're succeeding, to give us some kind of performance measurement factors. And lastly, a risk assessment of not only identifying the risk, but explaining how we're going to mitigate those that might threaten the success of the project, or contingency plans for major risks. And I think on that note, there's some appendix slides there for your information and benefit on some strategies on contract management for maintenance, but I'll end the presentation there and turn it over for any questions.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Poulin, for such clear and comprehensive presentation. It enriched our insight that ICT planning framework and cycle is very important. ICT needs a large amount of cost, large amount of investment, so we certainly do not want to waste such budget. The ICT budgeting related government department must be synergized in carrying out their respective role. So, to the participant who want to get more explanation, from Mr. Poulin, from the presentation, please feel free to ask any question. Do we have question from the floor? as we realize, yeah, from the presentation, that procurement is the key, yeah, regarding how we should get the right technology and to have the right appliance. Before investment, I think we should also consider the initial cost for hardware, software, and also application. So do we have question from the floor? From the presentation, we also learned that after we invest in the initial cost, yeah, for the hardware, software, and application, we should also to consider the maintenance. And also it is very important for us to consider time horizon, yeah, time frame, when we have to upgrade and also the replacement of the IT technology. So we have a question from the floor. So if we any question? As we realize, yeah, that ICT operation is also important. So we should also consider, yeah, the time frame from development, in which, yeah, the minimum should consider the 3 years for the development, and also for the when we should doing again regarding the next procurement. As we realize, yeah, the ICT technology is moving very fast. So the time horizon is very important. So we have a question from the participants. Any question?
May I question? I have question, Pak Rofi.
Please, Pak Agung.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Poulin, in delighted presentation. And then from your presentation, we know that the ICT need a huge investment, right, in capital and also in maintenance after we build the ICT. However, the user of the ICT is not only the government, but also the business and then the society. And how we can separate it? I mean, this is need strategic planning, which where is the government can build in what area, and then what area can be released to the business. I mean, so how we set the strategy of this kind of separated investment, government and then market. Thank you, Mr. Poulin.
Thank you. That's a good question. I came from a large tax administration of 42,000 people, where 5,000 of those people were IT developers and maintenance staff, maintaining infrastructure applications. So we were blessed to have internal capacity in government to do a lot of this work and a lot of this planning. Most countries I visit aren't blessed in that way. You don't have a large IT contingent of staff in the government, in the department, that can do the development of infrastructure, the development of applications. So you have no choice but to outsource to private sector partners to build it and to maintain it in most cases. And the reason for that is government salaries aren't attractive enough often to keep IT workers inside of government, or there's also just a shortage of skilled IT staff available to government. So yeah, but that means that from a leadership perspective, the Ministry of Finance heads a department, you have to develop competency in managing IT vendors. I mean, it's a skill. The risk you take anytime you do a terms of reference and post a tender and award a contract is the relationship is now governed by that terms of reference and that contract. And as the government, you know what the good outcome was that you wanted from this investment. You know what the value is supposed to be. But from the vendor's perspective, a good outcome from the contract is that they get paid. Secondary is that you're happy and you get the outcome you want, but that's secondary. The primary first requirement as a private sector vendor is that we get paid, that we make a profit. Yes, we want happy customers, but when things fall apart, if they've met the letter of the contract, they get paid. So managing that relationship, designing that contract to ensure that you get good value for money and good service is a challenge, and you have to develop expertise and be competent at doing it. And I guess it's something with more experience and some outside help. Get some consulting help on how to do this, because you can't do it by yourself. Another, good practice we've seen on some large IT tenders recently is that there's a separate tender for a quality assurance consultancy to help oversee the development of the tender specification, and then to help to oversee the execution of the project by the winning vendor, so that you have some help, some muscle behind you to help in managing that relationship with the vendor so that you get a good outcome. And I highly recommend that. I mean, it's often one of the larger accounting firms is who you hire to do that kind of work, and they're used to dealing with the contractors, and it can be very beneficial because, yes, in most instances, you can't do it in-house, you have to outsource it, which means you have to get very good at contract tendering and management to work with vendors.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Poulin, for the explanation. So basically, we really need skill, expertise, and also experience in IT management, including how we should manage vendor and contracts. So then we have the question from Brunei. Please, Brunei, raise your question. And later from Vietnam. Now, please, from Brunei. Brunei, could you hear my voice? Okay, so we also have question from IMF and also from Vietnam. So we still have not get a response from the Brunei. So maybe from Vietnam, please, you could ask your question.
Xin cảm ơn.
Thank you. First, I would like to thank Poulin for your presentation.
Okay, sorry. Hi, Mr. Poulin again, and Mr. Agung. Yeah, thank you for your presentation and also for your question just now, Mr. Agung. Yeah, I think my question will be quite related to yours as well. Okay, my question will be on how can we convince the higher management when it comes to costing wise, yeah, because we know that in terms of maintenance for IT, there is an exponential, cost towards it, and how can we convince the higher management that the maintenance, that the cost of the maintenance is always high towards the following years as well. If you can advise on that matters. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, that's I used to get asked that by my senior management at the tax agency, and there was an attitude, an opinion amongst the business lines and the CFO that IT just kept getting more expensive every year, and every time we built anything, we asked for more maintenance funding to support it. And so they used to joke that eventually the entire budget for the tax agency will be in the information technology branch, and there'll be nobody doing the other tasks in the agency. But that's the sense that they had. But we got around that eventually through discussion by documenting exactly where did the money go. We had to give a clear explanation of performance metrics on where does the IT dollar get spent? How much, you can show that the devices that are past 5 years have to be replaced. That's simple math. This is a bill that must be paid. Software upgrades, bill that must be paid. For maintenance of applications, we would track number of incidents, number of problems, number of system changes required, and show them in person days how much effort it took to do those things, so that it then explained why there were 1,000 application maintenance staff every year being paid to do nothing but maintain the applications that already existed. And it took about 2 years to develop all those measures and presentations and information to make a compelling argument that here it is, it's transparent, here is the evidence. And to close the argument, we gave back to the business and said, we're happy to reduce the maintenance spend on any application, but you have to pick which one, not me. As CIO, I shouldn't be picking. You as the business owners, you tell us which application should we cut the maintenance spend on. And I've already told you the consequence of cutting that spend will be that we can't respond to problem reports. The system, when it goes down, may stay down for 3 days instead of 30 minutes because we won't have the people there to do the support. And when they were given that power, because it was nice, they now felt they had control of the IT budget, they did nothing with it because nobody wanted to actually see their application have its maintenance spend cut. The other interesting thing that the CFO did of that organization was he did an audit covering 10 years of the IT spend, how big the IT spend was as a share of the revenue agency budget. And the audit showed that the IT spend was always 15% of the agency budget for 10 years in a row. It never changed. If IT went up, it's because the size of the agency went up. I mean, the agency got bigger, IT got bigger. It just stayed proportional at 15%. I hope that's helpful to you.
Thank you, Mr. Poulin. How we should convince the budget for maintenance is very important. Now we will collect questions from Vietnam and also from IMF. Please, Vietnam.
Xin cảm ơn ông.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to thank Mr. Poulin for your interesting presentation. But I can see that in your presentation is more about the user departments in terms of the budget. But I would like to talk about that from the perspective of the MOF, because we have some experience in Vietnam. Do you set out a percentage of ICT expenditure out of the total expenditures for the development of ICT? That's my first question. My second question is that because ICT is quite a unique field, and for a CFO, the assessment, I mean, when we look into the budgets for ICT, we need to have some background to be able to understand the budget for ICT. The point is how to ensure interoperationality of across departments for the common cause and purposes. For example, if we set out objectives that we want to develop an e-government, a digital economy, different spending units will have to follow a roadmap introduced by the government. They may pursue the same objectives, common objectives, and they need a budget for the purpose. How can we link that to make sure that the budget they proposed, can meet the requirements for such development? That's the second point. The third point is that in your presentation, you said that the life cycle of the hardware of the ICT system is very short, just about 5 years. So how can we, effectively allocate fund efficiently? For example, if we approve the budget for this year, and in the 5th year we approve budgets for the last units. So even if we have not invested in the second unit, the life cycle of the system in the first unit was was finished. So how can you have equal treatment? Otherwise, just invest in several units, but not the others, which is not very efficient. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vietnam. Now we will collect question from IMF. Please.
Yes, thank you, Pak Rofi. Thank you, Mr. Poulin, for the presentation. I think a lot of my remarks were already covered in the previous comments and questions. My main comment on your presentation was that first, it was extremely interesting, and second, indeed, one of the main difficulties for ministries of finance is the capacity to understand and challenge the budget that is coming from the IT department beyond being able to understand what is sent by the vendors and managing the relationship with external vendors. I think you've already given some interesting good practices to consider, which I think are important capacities to develop in the budget department, such as being able to develop some performance indicators for the IT department that will allow understanding what is exactly happening and what are the reasons for the budget increases. And also some things that I've seen in particular in OECD countries is some expenditure growth targets that may be set by the budget department for the IT department that are a baseline for discussing any change, any growth that is beyond what is targeted, and trying to engage in a little bit more into a budget negotiation with the IT department, because very often budget departments feel they don't have the technical knowledge and the capacity to challenge the budget requests that are coming from IT departments. So I stop here because I think a lot of this was already covered, but I think beyond the relationship with the vendor, leveraging performance budgeting, the performance systems that exist for discussing the budget request of IT departments within the MOF or outside of the MOF is also an important capacity that the budget departments need to develop.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Moretti. Now we will collect question from Cambodia. This should be the last question, for the session. Please, Cambodia.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you, Mr. Poulin, for a very good presentation. This is Supet from Ministry of Finance, Cambodia. I have a particular questions with regards to the operations and maintenance of the ICT. As you mentioned, the cost and the relationship between investment and operation and maintenance. I just want to ask if from a efficiency and cost point of view, is it possible for the IT department or some government units to take charge some or some works of the maintenance instead of the private company, or continuously, or to someday can take major works, major parts of the maintenance or operation of the IT system? Just from the, I heard your mention on the point of efficiency and human resource management, but I just want to ask is it possible, and is it economically viable and efficient? Thank you.
Thank you from Cambodia. Please, Mr. Poulin.
Thank you. I'll start with the last one first, since it's fresh on all of our minds. It is possible to build internal capacity to do maintenance support of applications and hardware, but it requires salaries that will attract and retain IT workers. Is a key problem in many countries. That you just can't offer them at government salary levels. And also, if you're going to do it, it requires leadership. You need someone who's competent to lead the IT organization with good standards, proper architectures, etc. But it's definitely possible. Canada Revenue did it. We're the exception, not the norm. But we had a very large and very competent IT organization. Many other countries, they have to outsource all of that work. Let's go to Vietnam. You know, the question, there were three. One was, what % of the budget should go to IT from a government department or government in general? You know, for tax agencies, I know the answer to that because the OECD did a study a few years ago, and the answer is 15%, 10 to 20% was the finding. Average being 15% of the department budget was spent on information technology. That's hardware, software, maintenance, all of it. Tax agencies are very IT intensive. They run on data. So many other departments would not be that high a percentage. They're not as, you know, they're not as reliant on accumulating large amounts of data and doing analytics on it and running large compliance programs. So that percentage might be less. How do you get cohesion across ministries so that infrastructure talks well to each other? I mean, that's a valid question and a problem in many countries. And those that have beaten it have done it through standards, developing architectural standards that anything you do, you'll do this way with regard to this type of infrastructure, these protocols on how applications talk, these internet standards. And those standards often come from the Treasury, the Chancellery. Someone has to speak on behalf of government-wide to say, these are our standards we're going to adhere to. It doesn't have to get down to the level of product specific, but it has to get down to, you know, the communication standards, the application interface standards. Are we going to have one portal for all of government, or is every department going to build their own? Those kinds of decisions have to be made by a central agency and then enforced. And how do you enforce them? Through the Ministry of Finance and the budget. If you're making a submission for an ICT development project, it has to adhere to all the announced standards and architectures. If it does not, then it does not get funded. Last question from Vietnam was, how do we budget for this, you know, 5-year replacement cycle for hardware? Well, you know, the good news is the replacement cost for hardware in 5 years is much less than the original cost, because the cost of hardware falls every year. That's been going on for more than 20 years, and it'll probably go on for another 20 years. Hardware continuously keeps getting less expensive. So you do have savings from on what it will cost coming all the time. The other aspect is the department or the Ministry of Finance, you have to acknowledge that cost going in. If you can't afford the cost to sustain something, then you shouldn't build it in the first place. So like, think about it before the investment, agree that you're going to you find a way to do it, and then you enforce that way to do it, whether it's taking budget from other line items and moving them to IT or whatever you have to do. But the agreement should be made as part of the investment decision, not after, when the bill comes due 5 years later or 3 years later. And lastly, that answer talks a bit to Delphine's point about, you know, how do we challenge IT submissions in the Ministry of Finance? We don't know IT. We're not competent to judge whether this is a good submission or not. Well, that's again, in our country, the Treasury Board played the challenge role before it got to the Ministry of Finance. Departments didn't get to go direct to the Ministry of Finance. They had to go through the Treasury Board. And the Treasury Board had people whose job it was to challenge the business cases. The other aspect is make your CFOs in departments step up to that challenge role. They need to understand the submission and challenge it and beat it up before it gets to the Ministry of Finance. So it's already had one challenge, and then it gets a final challenge at the Ministry of Finance. That would be my advice on that. I think that covers all the questions we had. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Poulin, for the excellent presentation and explanation. And also thank you for the question from the floor. Now we will next for the second presenter, Mr. Pilky Hong, who will present the summary of the recent PEMNA Advisory Service activity based on experience of ICT Budget Management in Korea and Indonesia. To Mr. Hong, please, the time is yours for 15 to 20-minute presentation.
Okay. Thank you for valuable presentation, Mr. Poulin. Peter Poulin, can you hear me? Raise your hand. Okay. So Mr. Paulin's presentation has a little bit of everything about ICT budgeting, because I guess you are very lucky to have a well-established organizations like tax agencies. It's almost similar in Korea, like a revenue department or tax department. They have very good resources in terms of money and capacity and ICT resources, but most of the departments, they want more and more for ICT budget, but they cannot secure enough budget. But we have to allocate efficiently the limited budgets. So actually we made assessment of Indonesian ICT budgeting, and then we just made a report on ICT budgeting with Professor Choi Young-jin from Ulchi University and Wibisana, Mr. Wibisana in Indonesia, with the support of Hari Purnomo from World Bank. So I have to recognize their great contribution to this report. Of course, all the errors are mine, as a disclaimer. Well, I don't have to take up your time, valuable time, so I will just go very on subject 1 and 2 over here. Then I'll describe the opportunities and improvement areas we found while we just made an assessment of Indonesian ICT budgeting. And we just try to explain or suggest some recommendations or how to do or what to do specifically. And then now I'll just make a concluding remarks. Okay, well, this one is a holy remark. So everybody knows we are in the fourth industrial revolution, and we are going through digital transformation. The point is, the conclusion is, okay, to do that, we need to invest. But the question is, do we have enough resources to invest? That's the main topic, main core issue of this presentation. So the last phrase, how to keep ICT budget aligned and consistent with the national ICT policy or national or ICT strategy. To support national ICT strategy, we must provide enough resources. But the problem is we don't have enough resources. So that's why we have to take a lot of time and resources, or take a lot of information from other countries like Canada to learn something about ICT budgeting. And when we make assessment with Indonesian budgeting, general budgetary process is almost similar to other countries' budgetary system. So I don't have to go through this one again. I'm sure most of the government have the similar budgetary process like Indonesia, depending on political system or fiscal year. But the one specific area we'd like to focus on is the fact that there is no category or there is no classified theme or area for ICT, which means it doesn't have a ICT account at the high level of a budget framework, okay? Because of they don't have any separate ICT budget item, it's not easy to follow on all the process of ICT project and ICT life cycle. It's not easy to monitor or manage, evaluate the ICT project because there is no separate ICT account in the budget plan. That is key issue we found over here. So over here, we described most of the ICT spend is not located in the program level, but in the output level, because ICT is a supportive element for the programs and activities. That's what it is in Indonesia. So the process of defining whether a particular output is ICT related output or not requires affirmative reasoning from the Communication and ICT Ministry. So the root cause of the key issues in ICT budgeting is there is no separate ICT account. There is no separate ICT budget at the first level. So it's not easy to make an effective allocation of ICT budget because there is no clear categorization or category or classification of ICT project or budget. Well, the overall budget ceiling, expenditure ceiling rarely changes, but its composition does. Its composition always changes. There is an expenditure ceiling on each ministry, department, or agencies. So within your budget ceiling, you have to allocate your resources. So classification and codification or tagging of ICT budget could help increasing efficiency in budgeting and managing the ICT budget. That's one of the key conclusion, key areas we draw from the assessment. Also, I goofed up over here. Also, even though you have a category for ICT budget or ICT project, how can we estimate our project? Which means, how can we make an accurate estimation of ICT project? That's one of the questions from the IMF Delphine. So how can we trust it? The submitted proposal from department? There should be some gatekeeper, or there should be someone who challenges the submitted ICT budget. Yeah, we deal with that issue in this presentation. To do that, one of the solution, or to do that, to clarify or to make a transparent budget process, we need kind of guidelines or guidance to cost the ICT project, which is commonly shared by all the department or agencies. In that case, the ministry or Ministry of Finance or Ministry of ICT, they can check out what cost is right or what cost is or too much, what cost is too little. So at least they can have some kind of reference. So we need a guidance to cost ICT projects. So there is no common guidance on breaking down system development cost, ICT operation, and maintenance cost in many countries. Especially in Indonesia, we could not find the clear-cut guidance on this cost breakdown on ICT projects. So each ministry has its own guideline. So there is no common guideline. For example, they have just the put this fixed cost by chart in the chart of account and put variable cost by procurement system. So they don't use common guideline. They don't use common guidance on ICT cost estimation. So we suggest common and coherent guideline or criterion based on actual data. Actual data is it means market data or just ongoing market data or past real data for estimating cost of ICT related budget could help increasing efficiency in budgeting and managing the ICT policy. So far, I just suggested two. One is, why don't you have a separate account for ICT project at the high level? Then what should we do? All right, I will provide common guideline for ICT cost estimation. Then you can just refer to these guidelines and you can make a proposal. What's the proposal? In that case, the Ministry of Finance can check this proposal to see if they just comply with all the guidelines and criterion provided by the Ministry of Finance. These issues all just related to the separate account of ICT. For example, if you don't have a clear-cut ICT project account, it's not easy to monitor. It's not easy to manage it. It's not easy to perform the ICT project. So I don't have to go through again. But I'd like to emphasize the last phrase over here. The information system for ICT project or ICT budget could increase budget efficiency in relation with the existing EAMS in Korea, enterprise architecture management system. So when you plan your ICT budget, you must enter all these related data in this enterprise architecture management system so that everyone can share this information. And also at the end of the closure of the ICT project, you must enter all the data regarding the ICT project in this system. Then everybody knows what that guy did, what we are doing. So across the department, everybody shares the same information through this information enterprise architecture management system. That's what we are doing in Korea, for example. And there is another issue in Indonesia, which is the coordination and harmonization across the department and across the between central government and local government, subnational, so-called subnationals. So who can coordinate or harmonize across department and between central government and local government? So you need a mechanism for coordinating or harmonizing in ICT area. Actually, we have an organization in Korea to monitor and coordinate the ICT activities between central government and local government, between ministries. For example, in NIA, National Information Agency. Now, I'll just brief opportunities and improvement areas very quickly based on the previous issues. So we just suggest why don't you set up a category for ICT project or ICT budget? And the Ministry of Finance should provide a common guideline so that each ministry can make their budget depending on the given provided guidelines, right? So the Ministry of Finance, they can just review all the submitted ICT budget, because all the ministry as departments have the same template, same kind of criterion when they make a proposal, right? And as is the same as is the way it is the same as in common guideline for ICT project costing. They have the same kind of template for ICT project, and they also have common guideline for ICT project costing. So there is no fluctuation across the department. There is no big discrepancies between department and agencies. So given the standard expenditure, for example, like general budget plus an ICT budgeting, Ministry of Finance can devolve their power to some ministries like ICT ministry, as Delphine Moretti from IMF asked about the capacity of the Ministry of Finance. Ministry of Finance doesn't understand very much about ICT. So the Ministry of ICT or lead ministry on ICT, they can serve as a gatekeeper before the Ministry of Finance. So Ministry of Finance can get opinion from the Ministry of ICT, which means all the ministries submit their ICT budget to MOF, Finance Ministry, and also to Ministry of ICT. Then Ministry of ICT give their opinion on each budget to Ministry of Finance. Then the Ministry of Finance can take or not the Ministry of ICT. Okay. Also, Ministry of ICT doesn't have full capacity to understand all the budgets, so they need some dedicated ICT expert organizations like NIA in Korea. This is an agency. Okay. Okay. I'll move very quick. So I don't have to. I don't have to hurry too much. Good stuff. Sorry. This is the example of the dedicated organization like Ministry of Finance, just get an opinion from Ministry of ICT, then Ministry of ICT just get opinion from, professional opinion from, like over here, National Information Agent Society, the Society Agency, or Korea Internet and Security Agency, blah, 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 blah. So the expert organizations give their opinion on budget and project to the Ministry of ICT. Then the Ministry of ICT give their summarized opinion to the Ministry of Finance. See, is it clear? That's the point. Oh shit. Recommendations, what and how to do. That's the kind of recapitulation, the summary of what I said just now. The first one is, okay, you must have a lead agency. You must have a dedicated expert organizations over here so that they can just coordinate and moderate between the MOF and line ministries, especially in terms of technology. The second one is you need a framework, and also you need a specific guidelines. That is an example in Korea. So in every step of business cycle, you need a specific related guidelines so that all the ministry, department agencies can refer to those guidelines. This is a specific suggestion to start with to Indonesia. So you can just have a good framework from UK or United States or Korea, whatever it is, but you must start from specific assessment of your country. This is my suggestion. Also, we suggest you have a ICT project management system, PMS, so that you can have all the data on ICT project and ICT budget across the government. The next one is, this is a kind of, I guess this is a feasibility study. In Korea, we have a system of preliminary feasibility study for very big project. But in ICT case, MOF doesn't have an expertise, doesn't have a capacity in ICT. So the Ministry of ICT conducts a preliminary feasibility study. So the Ministry of ICT says, okay, you don't have to go through this preliminary feasibility study. In this case, then Ministry of Finance usually don't conduct PFS, preliminary feasibility study. So Ministry of ICT conducts a preliminary feasibility study and gives their technological opinion on technology to Ministry of Finance. Next one is, all right, you need an ICT budget information system so that you can just collect all the data and share data on ICT budget. We suggest that Indonesian government refer to the Korean D-brain. In Korea, we call it D-brain, digital brain, D-brain. So if you are interested in this one, you can refer to D-brain. Concluding remarks is set up category for ICT budget or project first, and you need to provide guidelines, specific guidelines. They need lots of specific guidelines and guidances. And finally, all the countries should tailor recommendations or suggestions to meet its specific needs, budget challenges, and capacity constraints. So we suggest a gradual and iterative approach, starting from a pilot project and gradually diffusing, allowing for procedural, organizational, and institutional adaptation. And finally, good policy and framework guideline take intensive and iterative teamwork. Oh, this is for Terima kasih, because this was the Indonesian government. I just Terima kasih. I believe it's a thanks. Thanks again for your time.
Okay, thank you.
Over to Rafino. Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Hong. Terima kasih for such informative and essential presentation. We learned about increasing role of ICT budgeting, the issue in ICT budgeting, opportunities, as well as the area we should improve, and also guideline for ICT budgeting. Ladies and gentlemen, we have heard the presentation. So please ask questions. Do we have questions from the floor? As we realize, ICT needs huge budget, but this is a must. We still need to allocate the money to support the ICT, because ICT is a very important thing. The key is how we should make the right decision for investment. So do we have question? Okay, we have question from Vietnam. Then we will later collect other questions. So please, Vietnam.
Vâng, xin cảm ơn chủ tọa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm also thankful to the presentation of Mr. Hong. I can see many points that I'm interested in have been explained in your presentation. I am interested in the point that, and this is also the question I asked before to Mr. Poulin. I think that we need an agency to act as the orchestra leader, as the basics for the Ministry of Finance or the CFO to approve the budget. Because you know that the CFOs do not have the IT background to be able to appraise or to review the budget proposals submitted by the government. So I fully agree with that. We need to have somebody to act as the coordinator and harmonizer. Secondly, I also see that we need a line item for ICT to flow through. Can you please elaborate more on this? I mean, when we spend for ICT, we have the capital expenditure and operational or recurrent expenditures for ICT. In operational expenditures, we spend for in different functions: health, education, sports, defense. We spend on ICT in all of the functions. So when you classify by ICT, and then we also classify by functions, it seems to be very complicated. Should we follow that, or should we, try to reclassify at the disaggregate at the lower level to be able to track it? And about Korea, should we actually earmark a percentage for ICT spending? Because when you in your presentation, it seems that everything is proposed from a unit, but from the macro level, should we set a target to earmark something for ICT? For example, in Vietnam, we can set a target of 1 or 2%, but it fragments the budget. And I would like to ask for your opinion about this. Thank you very much.
Thank you. From Vietnam, do we have other questions? So if there is no other question, please, Mr. Hong, to answer the question.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the remarkable question, for poor presentation. Then on earmarking budget, I guess in Korea we have also 2 or 3% of budget, but I'm not sure we just earmark for specific items. For example, we try to earmark budget for education or defense budget, but in ICT, it's not clear we have earmarked. So in the next session, the Ministry of Finance in Korea, they will make a presentation. So I'm sure he will answer that question. On the second one, how can we have a IT budget for specific line items, for example? But in many countries, it's depending on the budgetary system. For example, in many countries, they have a project budget system, or they have expenditure ceiling. Then the ministry, they have a prior to kind of what will you say? They have a criterion to prioritize the importance of ICT budgets, right? So if you have a line item budget system, you may have a specific items for ICT, for hardware, notebook, or memory, something like that. But in many cases, you don't have to. You don't have to allocate your budget to like these specific line items. As long as you have a maximum efficiency or maximum function to support your main businesses, you can allocate your ICT budget depending on your requirement or needs.
We cannot hear you anymore, sorry.
In Korea, sorry, we don't have a specific criterion for specific items. We just have a sort of limited ceiling for ICT projects. So you can allocate your budget within project system. But usually when you make a budget proposal, you just itemize all the budgets at a very specific level, right? So we don't specify the specific criterion to allocate our budget on specific items. What was your first question? I'm sorry. What was your first question?
I think that you have answered most of the points.
Okay.
And I agree with you. Yes, I just mentioned the third point. It's just to reaffirm my agreement with your points that we need somebody to act as the
coordinator or moderator of ICT. Yes, that's it. It's not a question.
Okay, okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Hong, for the comprehensive presentation and explanation. So I think we already run out of the time. Yeah, we already overrun the time. So I return the floor to the Secretariat for the second session. Thank you to all of the participants and the presenters.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pak Rofi, for moderating the first session. Now we'll move on to the second session. This session will be moderated by Mr. Robin van Kiepersluy, Senior Public Sector Specialist at the World Bank. Robin, over to you.
Thank you so much, and good morning, everyone. Good evening from Washington, D.C. I'm Robin van Kiepersluy, and with the World Bank. We've had some very interesting presentations and I think a very lively discussion. Now in this second part of the webinar, we will have two distinguished speakers. We will hear from Dong-hun Yu, who is Deputy Director in the Budget Office for ICT in the Korea Ministry of Economy and Finance. And we will hear from Agung Hidayat Purwanto. He is the head of the Subdirectorate of the Directorate of State Budget Planning in Indonesia Ministry of Finance. So we have an opportunity to really hear very specific country examples and country challenges and experiences. I ask you again to share perhaps your questions that you have during the presentations already in the chat, so we can see what questions are coming in and can have an effective discussion. This second session is only in the agenda for 30 minutes, so it's a little bit shorter. But I understand we can take these 30 minutes, including questions and answers. So I want to ask both speakers to really try and be very focused and limit their presentations to, let's say, 10 minutes, 10 to 12 minutes. So we do have an opportunity to really ask questions and hear their responses. So with that, I would like to hand over to Mr. Dong-hun Yu from Korea. Please go ahead.
Good morning and afternoon, everyone. I am Dong-hun Yu, Deputy Director in ICT Budget Division of the Ministry of Economy and Finance. It is truly an honor to be here and make a presentation about the ICT budget of Korea. Next. Yes. There are four main content that I'd like to share today. First content is the rapid trend in ICT investment and result, and respectively, ICT budgeting priorities in 2022, and efficient ICT budget preparation, and new government policy roadmap will be presented. Next. Now, I'd like to show you the latest trend in ICT investment and result. Before jumping into main content, I'll briefly explain about the global ICT industry trend. The world is currently pursuing national innovation, focusing on developing ICT industries such as content-based service and AI, etc. Content-based service has grown rapidly the past 3 years due to COVID-19, and as a result, create various new online markets. The most representative examples are Netflix and Zoom. Netflix has been a great success by providing a service that allows people to enjoy any content and at any time while lying on their bed without visiting more theater or outside. The number of Netflix users have significantly increased from 1,000 million in 2019 to 210 million in 2021, more than doubled. Zoom also played a great role in changing the working environment. Most of companies are adapted to working home system, and now it is more familiar for us to have a meeting on online than on offline, which is a big change since we rarely used online platforms 3 years ago. AI industry also has become very important in ICT field. Applying AI in industries was very limited before due to technical issues, but now it has begun to be applied to all the industry. The AI applied companies are experiencing positive outcomes. 30% of AI applied companies have experienced revenue growth, and 41% have experienced cost savings. Next. As the importance of the ICT industry increases every year, Korea has been expanding financial investment in the ICT field past 5 years. The annual average growth rate of ICT budget investment from year 2016 to 2021 is 24.2%, which is a very high growth rate considering the total government budget increase was 9.7%, especially core ICT investment areas such as data, AI, and contactless service increased to 88.9% in year 2021 compared to year 2019. Next. With the aggressive investment on ICT area, we have achieved various outcomes not only domestically but also globally. First, we laid groundwork to development ICT industries such as cloud, data and AI. The cloud industry in Korea is expected to grow more than 40% annually. Also, data and AI industries are expected to have 11.3% and 30% of annual growth. We also have acquired good reputation in international evaluation. OECD ranked Korea the first in digital government index in 2020. Also, Bloomberg ranked Korea the first in innovation index in 2021. Next. For this slide, I briefly explain the process of selecting 5 investment priorities. First, we analyzed the effort published by Gartner, Forbes, and many others in order to fully understand future core technologies. After analyzing the tech trend, we derived 7 future core technologies as 5G, AR and VR, data analysis, etc. And at last, with the emphasis on developing and fostering the above 7 technologies, we select 5 major investment fields such as data, big bang, and 5G. Next. This slide presents the overall ICT budget for year 2022, including 5 major investment fields. The total budget for ICT in 2022 is 2.8 trillion won, an increase of 21% from 2.3 trillion won in 2021. The budget for the 5 major investment areas is 21 trillion won in 2022, an increase of 40% from 1.5 trillion won in 2021, accounting for 76% of the total ICT budget. In particular, we have set the largest budget in data big bang in order to develop and spread high quality data, which is the base of the all ICT ICT industries. Next. Now, I'll explain in more details about 5 major investment fields. The first one is big bang data across industry. The purpose of this investment is to lay the foundation for generating high quality and large capacity data, which is the core infrastructure in digital economy. The main projects are AI learning data building and big data platform center. These two projects are to create and analyze high quality data for core industries as autonomous driving and healthcare, so on. By investing heavily on data big bang, we expect to enhance economic productivity by strengthening data collecting, processing, utilizing system. So far, we have achieved growth in the number of data supplying domestic companies by 95%, data industry market expansion by 14%, and lastly, more than 50,000 job creation. Next. The next is 5G innovation. Korea developed and used 5G for the first time in the world in April of 2019. Taking advantage of these infrastructure strengths, 5G innovation was selected as a core investment area to discover innovate 5G services and further secure competitiveness in the global market. The main projects are VR and AR content industry promotion and enabling in the 5G ecosystem in public sector. Both projects are aimed at creating a new business by applying 5G service to various fields as in national security, logistics, and manufacturing. Through investment in 5G innovation, 5G service that reflects demand in various industries were developed and distributed. And also Korea exports of 5G-related equipment and services exceeded 79 trillion won in 2021. Next. The third is ICT talent development. ICT talent training is promoted with the aim of resolving the shortage of software talent due to the rapid digital transition across the industry. The main projects are building an ICT talent ecosystem and innovation academy. These two projects are operated to expand the startups in the ICT field by fostering high-quality talents as well as fostering sufficient talent, reflecting the on-site demand of companies. In 2022, a total of 21,000 digital talent will be trained and 6,000 new IT startups will be created. Next. Fourth is the field of digital inclusion. Digital inclusion is to provide a digital education and infrastructure so that there are no barriers for everyone in Korea to participate in the digital economy. Major projects include the digital divide solution and network infrastructure building. These projects support digital capabilities such as mobile education for vulnerable groups such as the disabled and the elderly, and also build the free Wi-Fi in public places so that there are no people excluded from digital infrastructure. And so far, 1,000 digital learning centers are established and operated nationwide to provide digital education to more than 500,000 underprivileged people annually. Free Wi-Fi is also built and operated in 140,000 public places. Next. The fifth and the last one in major investment part is cybersecurity, which has a purpose of building a cybersecurity country with a safety internet environment. Major projects are hacking virus response system and improving competitiveness of cybersecurity industries. Cyber threats have rapidly increased as the online environment has been expanded since COVID-19. To deal with this circumstance, we have not only established a public-private joint simulation training system to strengthen basic cyber threat capabilities, but also AI-based malicious domain monitoring system to effectively respond to a significant increase in cyber attack. Next. The next part is about improving efficiency in ICT budgeting. As mentioned in an earlier slide, investment in the ICT sector continued to expand, but there was possibility of wasting the budget due to the lack of a screening process. Therefore, starting this year, we are adopting an ICT preview system for new projects to build a systematic pricing and business profitability evaluation. We expect this to reduce the risk of unnecessary budget execution and to achieve higher expected return for our projects. And about the budget CoP, propelling and programmatic programs, we are trying hard to establish the virtuous cycle system to reinvestment in ICT-focused investment areas by drastically reducing the budget of projects that are insufficient in performance or that are rudely invested. Next, final. The last slide of today's presentation is new government policy roadmap. In May this year, a new government will be launched in Korea, and I'd like to introduce a new ICT policy as called Government as a Digital Platform. The main goal of this new policy is to establish a digital government platform for providing smart and fair public services. The decision-making for government operation will be made on the scientific and data-based method. Not only that, the administrative system will be adapting AI and big data technology for public service optimization, and will also provide a better public education for bridging digital divide for underprivileged people. That is everything I have prepared today, and I really appreciate for listening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dong-hun Yu, for quite a dense presentation. I think many elements that are of interest. I thought it was very interesting to learn about these 5 major investment objectives that you shared: big data, 5G, ICT, talent development, digital inclusiveness, and also cybersecurity. So I imagine there are several questions. So let's open the floor for questions right away. Who would like to go first? I see, yeah, I see hands going up right now. I think from our team in Cambodia. Please go ahead.
First of all, thank you very much for a very good presentation.
Đồng chí Nam đăng ký cho Việt Nam nha.
Hello.
Please go ahead.
Yes. With respect to the presentation on slide number 4, I can see that the investment in ICT in Korea is responsible by Ministry of Science, Technology, and Information and Technology. I want to ask, is this ministry the only one who is in charge of the ICT, or the ICT expenditure can be allocated or happen at other line ministries? Or is it just this presentation only focus on 5 areas of main expenditure in ICT in investment in Korea? Thank you.
Mr. Dong-hun Yu, would you like to respond? Dong-hun Yu, we cannot hear you.
강제점을 포함해서 포함된 금액이다. 그게 첫 번째로는 다른 부처도 일부 있고 메인은 미니스트리 오브 ICT하고 그리고 이 금액은 5가지 그 핵심 사업들이 포함된 거다. 아시죠?
The main ministry, line ministry, is the Ministry of Science and ICT, and there are also other relevant ICT agencies in Korea. And this presentation and the budget, ICT budget, includes these major 5 investment projects, and they are also included in other ICT spending is increased. It is involved in the total ICT budget.
So with that reply, other questions you would like to ask?
Just in relation to just a little bit further. So it means the other line ministry in Korea also have the expenditure on ICT as well. Just to make sure that in Korea, the Ministry of Science and Information Technology is not the only ministry who is in charge of all the ICT works within the government. Thank you.
Yes, other line ministry have also ICT budget themselves. But this Ministry of Science and ICT is taking the role as a leadership ICT agency.
Thank you.
Đồng chí Nam đăng ký giúp cho Việt Nam nha.
So can we ask a question from Vietnam?
Absolutely, please go ahead.
We would like to raise a question just for clarification. In your presentation, you said that you are having 5 major projects, in the responsibility of the Ministry of the MSIT. So these are the projects to cover the whole economy. Can you please explain? I mean, is there any criteria to make a distinction of the major projects that are implemented for the whole economy of some important ministries and the projects that are proposed and implemented by other departments and ministries? Because you know that Vietnam is also trying to develop the digital economy. Many ministries are trying to propose something, even though we have the Ministry of Information and Communication to be responsible for developing standards and infrastructure. But we can see a lot of overlaps across ministries. And from the Ministry of, from the Korea experience, I think that you have a ministry who is responsible for the overall projects. And maybe you can explain more about the coverage. What are the criteria that should be centralized for the whole economy? What should be specific projects to support ministries by ministries? Over.
Mr. Dong-hun Yu, please go ahead.
Sorry, I'm trying to listen from the presenters, and then let me provide interpretation.
Yeah.
As for the first question, when we select the 5 major investment projects, we refer to the latest ICT trends. That is how we selected the 5 major ICT investment projects. And if let me provide an example. If, as we mentioned, we are trying to build a digital government as a platform. When it comes to that project, we will receive relevant budget requests from the line ministries, and then the Ministry of Science and Technology will collect the data, and then the digital government as a platform budget will be expressed in the Ministry of Science and Technology budget.
Thank you so much. I imagine there may be more questions, but with an eye on the time, I would like to suggest we move to the second presentation. And if your question is not fully answered or you have additional questions, please still post them in the chat so we can follow up with you and respond to you later. But with an eye on the time, I would like to move to the brief presentation from Mr. Agung Hidayat Purwanto. So the floor is yours. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Robin. Good morning, everybody. Okay, good morning, everybody. On this great occasion, I would like to thank the Secretary of PEMNA, who has given us the opportunity to share what we are doing now and also learn about other countries, especially from Korea, so that we can get the good input for future improvements. I also would like to thank to PEMNA Secretary, who has provided the opportunity to collaborate in conducting studies for improvements related to ICT budgeting in Indonesia. We have held a discussion with experts facilitated by PEMNA since 2021 until now, whose report will be soon completed and useful for us as a guidance for future improvements and increasing the effectiveness and efficiency of budgeting in the ICT sector in Indonesia. And the topic that I will raise in this short presentation is closely related to the objectives of the study we are currently conducting, which is the opportunities and challenges of ICT development in Indonesia and how the governments through an effective and efficient budgeting mechanism can optimizing the output. If you look at the data that I show you, Indonesia has large enough opportunity for the development in the ICT sector. The total population in Indonesia is around 273.1 million people, of which 55% are in urban area. Currently, mobile phone users in Indonesia exceeded the total population, which is 124% of the total population in Indonesia. This can happen because one person may have more than one active number. Furthermore, there are 175.4 million internet users with a penetration rate of 64%, of which 160 million people are active on social media. Currently, many internet users in Indonesia use their social media as a means to gain added value, including as an effective promotion tool and also disseminate information through social media channels while benefiting from the creative contents they have created. This also makes the value of the e-commerce market value around 13.6 million USD. In responding to these opportunities, the government designed policy direction for development in the ICT sector. Hopefully, these policy designs can encourage inclusive digital transformation for all Indonesian people. Firstly, it's related to digital citizens through increasing digital skills and literacy So hopefully there will be an increase in the optimal use of digital technology by the community. Secondly, the development of the digital economy, which includes increasing the use of digital through payment and trade transactions. Currently, the digital economy is growing rapidly in Indonesia, which has been accelerated by the COVID-19 pandemic as mobility restriction to prevent transmission. Most people in Indonesia now feel comfortable to make transactions through digital platforms, so that the e-commerce has grown very significantly from transaction, not only goods and services, but also the use of public transportation like we have Indonesia, namely Gojek and Grab. Another example is the redistribution of cash transfer to low-income and vulnerable communities through cashless mechanism in the pandemic. This forces the lower classes of society to increase their financial literacy. However, this service can only be implemented in areas that have internet network coverage. This is the challenges. Don't forget that the Indonesia consists of more than 70,000 islands, which of course that is one of challenges in the equitable distribution of the ICT development. The third is about related to the optimizing public services through digital government. For example, at this time, we at the Ministry of Finance are greatly assisted by the development of digitizing services, both to the community and administrative settlements. Currently, we are able to carry out administrative tasks remotely because it is supported by adequate digital facilities and infrastructure. This is one of the positive impact of the pandemic, namely the acceleration of the digitization for public administrations. Once again, all of these digital services can be realized if they are supported by one extraordinary below, namely connectivity, which is a prerequisite for successful ICT development. In the future, Indonesia has planned to improve efficiency by optimizing the use of technology in government services. For example, currently the government has 2,700 data centers spread over and owned by various line ministry and agencies. In the future, we have planned to build only 2 national data centers that integrate the scattered data centers that can be used together. And this national data center will be designed in such a way that can meet the needs of service users in the line ministries and agencies. Through the use of an integrated data center, it is hopefully that it will increase efficiency in terms of operating and maintenance, as well as guarantee of the level security. And another example is that currently there are around 400,000 agencies that use internet, which of course is very vulnerable to security system disturbance because they have different security protocols. In the future, for certain government units will use the intranet service, so that it is expected to increase the effectiveness, not only communication between G2G, government to government, government to business, and government to customer and government to employee, but also level of security system. In addition to the above, the government is currently designing a general application base that can meet the administrative needs of each line ministry. From this general application base, line ministry can modify according to their needs, but with the same platform. So the data integration will be more easy to do. And in addition to that, the government is designing an Indonesian database, where the general data produced by line ministry and agency can be set to one to another in order to the need of the policy making. For example, currently we don't know how much social protection received by a person, because there are more than one program that managed by several line ministry and agencies. So this exchange and integration of the data through one Indonesian data we call it Satu Data Indonesia, will merge ownership of the data from certain line ministry into national ownership, which will enable every ministry and agency to utilize the data according to their work and level. To realize this plan, next we will discuss in general how the allocation will be made in accordance with the existing mechanism in Indonesia. Before discussing further, I would like to inform you that in Indonesia, there is a separation of authority between the unit responsible for national development planning, in this case, Bappenas, we call it Bappenas, and then Ministry of Finance, which is the unit that formulates fiscal capacity and allocates the budget for line ministry based on the plans made by the Bappenas. Okay, from the slide that I saw you, first, this is the circulate of the budget. First, the line ministry will prepare the medium-term ICT proposal in accordance with the President's vision and mission and submit it to the Bappenas and the Ministry of Finance. Based on the proposal, Bappenas will synchronize it with the National Development Plan and compile it into medium-term development plans. This is a document in a 5 years basis. Meanwhile, the Ministry of Finance will look at the costing needs as outlined in the medium-term expenditure framework, and both document, the medium-term development planning and medium-term of expenditure framework will serve as a reference in planning and allocating the annual budget. In the annual planning, the line ministry will resubmit its annual proposal to the Ministry of Finance and Bappenas, and to be resynchronized with the annual National Development Plan. Why is it need to be resynchronized? Because along the way, there will be adjustments to the national development targets that are adjusted to the situation and condition as well as the fiscal capacity mentioned every year. For example, right now, Indonesia have the medium-term development plan for 5 years in the current period 2019 to 2024. However, this is arranged in 2029, yeah, because we have experiencing the pandemic in 2020. So the medium-term development plans will need adjustment to its development targets, including prioritizing the handling of health problem and social protection compared to infrastructure development. So the infrastructure projects in 2020 has been delayed, so they need to be resubmitted for completion regarding to the delay in completion to the 2023 and 2024, when the pandemic right now is under control and there's a need to accelerate infrastructure completion, which has been delayed. Back to the budgeting cycle stage for the ICT, in addition to the annual proposal to the Ministry of Finance and Bappenas, Line Ministry also needs to submit an ICT related proposal to the Ministry of Telecommunication and Informatics. So this is the line ministry, the coordinating line ministry for the ICT development sector. So they will synchronize with the grand design of the national ICT development, and this grand design should have been included in the medium-term development plans, but the details need to be reviewed again by the Ministry of Telecommunication and Information, especially related to the costing and also item details, whether it is included in the ICT criteria or not. And the Ministry of Telecommunication and Informatics send the result of the review to the Ministry of Finance, and the result is used as the basis for budget allocation. In terms of allocation, Indonesia doesn't have a budget plotting mechanism for a certain sector. We don't have earmarking for certain budget allocation. For example, ICT, yeah, So in terms of allocation, Indonesia use the basis of the allocation of program and activities that become priorities at certain years. Based on the priorities, fiscal capacity will be used to finance these programs and activities. Furthermore, I think this is already explained detail by Professor Hong, but under the PEMNA Advisory Program, we have discussed the budgeting flow and the mechanism for reviewing the proposed ICT proposal. And in more detail, there is still room for improvement for the ICT budgeting in Indonesia. So this is several room for improvement. First is government must make sure that the strategic programs and projects are planned and implemented by the government-wide ICT organization. And the second is government must make sure that strategic programs and projects are managed by the organization with expert and authority regarding sectors and governmental reforms. Third, identifying and classifying the ICT program and related ICT budget set aside from other programs and projects. And fourth, the ICT ministry, in this case, the Ministry of Telecommunication and Informatics, focus more on the technological aspect with economic benefit, consulting the Ministry of Finance on the feasibility of the proposed project. The financial management information system has systematic linkage with a performance management system. And last is the need of the expert dedicated program to conduct the preliminary feasibility studies. More about this room of improvements already discussed by Professor Pilky Hong in the previous session. And also in more detail, maybe we will see it in the PEMNA report soon. Okay, I will stop here. Comments and questions are very welcome. I will return to moderator. Thank you, Robin.
Thank you so much, Mr. Agung. And I think you're really taking us on a journey here, right? From the potential in ICT development and the foundations to the specific changes that you are putting in place. And it's also quite obvious that you've benefited from the advisory program, right? The advisory services and some of the specific points, for example, on pre-feasibility studies came back as one of the points of attention. So thank you so much for sharing your presentation and sharing this journey, if I may. We are running a little late, but I would like to at least give you the opportunity to ask one or two questions before we hand over and for closing remarks. So please go ahead with questions for the presenter. Who would like to respond or share a question with Mr. Agung? Or perhaps a comment, Mr. Pilky, from your side. I see that you are on. Yeah,
because it's too silent, so I just make some points regarding Mr. Agung's presentation. On the recommendation or suggestions we made in our report, some recommendations should be in step with other kind of structural, institutional, or procedural reform or changing. And some recommendations should be taking place in sequence. So even though the recommendation looked very good and it looked very good on paper, but when it comes to implementation or execution of this recommendation requires lots of sophisticated strategy or tactics to succeed. So we can just discuss with lots of experts over here, but finally I remind you that the recommendations should be sophisticated, planned, and should be executed. That's all. Thank you. Perfect.
And I see Mr. Agung nodding to your comments and remarks. So full alignment there, and I think also a testimony to how useful this learning experience can be between countries. Any final other questions? If not, I will. I want to thank you very much for the discussion and the presentations in this second part of the webinar, and hand over to Dr. Ha from the PEMNA Secretariat.
Thank you, Robin. Good morning, afternoon, and evening, everyone. I'd like to thank you all for attending the first PEMNA BCOP webinar in 2022. With the theme of budgeting for ICT, we had a quite extensive knowledge exchange during this webinar. As you are aware, ICT is one of the largest capital expenditure departments make, and the role and the impact of ICT have been increasing since the outburst of the COVID-19. I hope this exchange of a wealth of information and insights on ICT budgeting could be meaningful for PEMNA member countries in reviewing and deciding ICT budget in line ministries. As we wrap up our meeting, I would like to express a few words of gratitude to those who made this meeting possible. First, I'd like to thank Mr. Rofianto Kunyawan, PEMNA BCOP Chair, for the excellent opening remarks and moderating the first session. I'm very grateful to Mr. Oleksiy Balebushko, PEMNA BCOP Facilitator, for all his excellent efforts on organizing and facilitating this meeting. I really appreciate Mr. Robin Van Kippers-Lewis for moderating the second session in this late time in DC. And my special thanks go to our presenters, Mr. Peter Poulin and Professor Pilky Hong, for sharing your knowledge and experiences in ICT budgeting. The presentations were really helpful in understanding what to oversight and consider in ICT budgeting. I would like to thank all the country presenters, Mr. Dong-hun Yu and Mr. Agung Hidayat Purwanto. Your presentations added the invaluable details of ICT budgeting in Korea and Indonesia. I would also like to thank the delegates from the PEMNA member countries, colleagues from World Bank, EU, IMF, and US OTA for engaging in such fruitful and constructive exchanges through this webinar. Let me conclude by thanking all of you once again for your time and valuable insights. We are hoping that a face-to-face meeting could be available soon, and I look forward to meeting you in person at the next PEMNA meeting. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.